He slapped me so hard the sound cracked across the hall like a pistol shot. For a heartbeat, time fractured. 280 guests froze in place. Champagne glasses half raised, forks hovering over prime rib, conversation sliced mid-sentence. Eyes darted between us, disbelief painted across every face. The sting flared across my cheek, sharp and hot, but I didn't flinch. Years of training had drilled that out of me. My uniform shifted slightly from the force, the rows of ribbons clinking faintly as though reminding me why I was standing tall in the first place. This wasn't a private scolding. This wasn't anger behind closed doors. This was my wedding day, and my father, Richard Halstead, chairman of Halstead Enterprises, builder of a tech empire, man of power and presence, had just struck his daughter in front of everyone. The hall smelled of polished wood, roses, and expensive whiskey, but all I felt was the burn on my cheek and the weight of 280 pairs of eyes. My father's command had already been spoken once, his voice dripping with disdain. "Take off those silly medals." He'd said it like the service ribbons across my chest were trinkets from a costume shop, an embarrassment to his carefully constructed image. I had answered him with only a quiet shake of my head, chin high, posture unbroken. And that's when his hand lashed out. But before I could react, another hand moved faster. Strong, steady, gloved and white, my fiancé James stepped between us. A 4-star Navy SEAL. He didn't need to raise his voice or posture for effect. His grip closed around my father's wrist with calm, iron control, unyielding but measured. He leaned in, speaking so low that only the first few rows could hear. 8 words. That was all it took. 8 words that shifted the weight of the entire room. Whatever power my father thought, he commanded, dissolved like smoke. The guests didn't gasp. They didn't shout. Instead, a wave rose across the hall, people standing, one by one, until the entire crowd was on its feet. It wasn't chaos. It was collective judgment, silent but deafening. My father, who had spent his life mastering rooms, suddenly looked small, his face drained of color, his eyes flicking around like a cornered man. My cheek still burned, but my pride held firm. I wasn't just a bride, and I wasn't just his daughter. In that moment, I was a decorated officer, and the room knew exactly where respect belonged. It started with the medals. To my father, they were nothing more than colored scraps, strips of ribbon, that clashed against his vision of elegance. He called them silly in the same tone he used when dismissing a waiter, or waving off an inconvenient question at a board meeting. But to me, those medals weren't ornament. They were my life. Each one carried its own story. Deserts where the sun peeled skin from bone, seas that tossed steel ships like toys, nights when the only sound was the crackle of a radio, and the breath of the men beside me. They weren't shiny decorations to impress a crowd. They were scars turned visible, proof that I had endured, decided and survived. My father couldn't see that. He'd spent a lifetime treating uniforms as lesser, service as second class. In his world, CEOs gave orders. Soldiers took them. That was the philosophy he raised me under. The suit above the uniform, profit above sacrifice. So when he looked at me in my dress whites, ribbons displayed with precision, all he saw was rebellion against the legacy he had tried to script. He sneered when he told me to take them off. The words landed heavier than the slap that followed, because they weren't just instructions. They were an attempt to erase the only truth I had ever fully owned. I knew defying him would ignite fury, but I also knew compliance would have meant betrayal of myself, of the men and women I'd stood beside, of the vows I'd already lived out long before I spoke them at any altar. That's why my head shook once, slow and deliberate. No, that tiny refusal, that refusal to strip away my history, is what tipped the scale. He couldn't control it. For a man who had built an empire on commanding rooms, on bending others to his will, the sight of his daughter standing unbent was unbearable. That's why his hand flew. But medals aren't costumes. They're currency paid in blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. My father thought they diminished me in front of his world, of suits and investors. Instead, they revealed him, exposed his blindness to everything that couldn't be bought. And when the room stood, they weren't rising against a slap. They were rising in defense of what those medals meant. The moment his hand struck, I didn't have time to process the sting. before another force stepped in. James moved with the kind of precision that doesn't announce itself. It simply happens. 1 second, my father's hand was still hanging in the air. The next, it was locked in James's grip, halted mid-motion like steel meeting stone. James didn't shove, didn't snarl, didn't posture. He didn't need to. Years as a Navy SEAL had etched calm into his bones. He stood between us, tall and steady, his white gloves pressed firmly around my father's wrist, with just enough strength to remind him he was no longer in command. The room fell even quieter. You could almost hear the chandeliers hum. My father tried to glare, but James leaned in close, his voice low, deliberate, and devastatingly clear. "You just struck a decorated U.S. Navy officer." 8 words, not shouted, not dressed in threats, just truth, so sharp it cut through the marble silence and left my father trembling. For decades, he had lived by the power of his name, the weight of his wealth, the intimidation of his reputation. But in that instant, none of it mattered. The balance shifted. The first rows heard James directly, but the effect rippled backward like a wave. People didn't need the details. They felt the authority in his tone, the conviction in his stance. Respect is contagious when it's real. One by one, guests began to rise. Not in panic, not in protest, but in judgment. Chairs scraped against polished floors. Gowns rustled. Uniforms straightened. Within seconds, the entire hall stood on its feet. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't noise. It was solidarity. A verdict, silent but undeniable. My father, who had spent his life commanding rooms with speeches, suddenly found himself speechless. The hand James held began to tremble. The color drained from his face. His empire of control, built brick by brick over decades, crumbled in the presence of a man who didn't need to argue, only state what was true. I stood a step behind James, my cheeks still throbbing, my ribbons faintly glinting in the fractured light from stained glass. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't carrying this battle alone. My fiancé wasn't just defending me. He was defending everything those medals represented. The hall shifted in a way no stock price or boardroom speech could command. 280 guests stood shoulder to shoulder, not because they were asked, but because instinct told them where honor belonged. It was a verdict without a gavel. On one side, men and women in tailored suits. The investors, the CEOs, the polished crowd. My father had spent a lifetime impressing. On the other side, uniforms. SEALs, Marines, sailors, brothers and sisters I had bled with. For once, there was no divide. They rose together. Silence grew heavy, almost physical. It wasn't the uneasy hush of embarrassment. It was the solemn weight of judgment. My father had thrived his entire life on commanding attention, but this attention wasn't the kind he could manipulate. He stood pale, trembling, his wrist still trapped in James's steady grip. One voice broke through the stillness. Torres, leaning lightly on his prosthetic, his presence as solid as granite, called out 3 words that cut through the air: "Admiral on deck." The response was instant. Every uniformed guest snapped to attention, saluting with crisp precision. Even civilians, though untrained, rose a little taller, mimicking the motion with awkward sincerity. The air changed. It wasn't my father's empire anymore. It was a space owned by respect. For years, my father had dismissed my medals as meaningless, my service as wasted potential. But in that moment, those silly ribbons were the only truth in the room. They outweighed every deal he had ever signed, every building that carried his name. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The hall itself had spoken. My father's empire was built on glass and image. Mine was built on grit, loyalty, and sacrifice. The difference was visible now, to everyone, especially to him. James released his wrist, slow and deliberate, like a man letting go of something fragile or already broken. My father stumbled back, half a step, his face drained of the power he had always wielded so effortlessly. For the first time, he wasn't the tallest figure in the room. I stood straighter, cheek still burning but spirit unshaken. The verdict was delivered, and it was final. Wealth commands attention, but honor commands respect. If you want to understand why that slap carried decades of weight, you have to know where I came from. I didn't grow up in a home. I grew up in an empire. Our house sat high on a hill, outside Boston, glass and stone arranged like a fortress. Inside, it felt less like family and more like a schedule. My father, Richard Halstead, didn't raise children. He groomed heirs. Every day he moved through our home, like a general inspecting troops. His uniform wasn't camouflage. It was custom suits, ties knotted with military precision, shoes polished to mirrors. Dinner was at 6:30 sharp. Conversation wasn't about affection. It was about performance. My brothers were quizzed on market trends, praised for golf swings, encouraged to dream about hedge funds and IPOs. Me? I was judged by appearances. You'll be measured by who you marry, not what you do, he told me more than once. I was a pawn on his chessboard, meant to seal alliances, not someone with ambitions of her own. My mother was the only softness in that house. She loved books and art, whispered poetry at bedtime, kissed, scraped knees, and told me not to let anyone, even my father, decide my worth, but her voice was often drowned out by his. I remember being 12, showing off an A in civics, and asking to join the junior ROTC program at school. I thought maybe he'd be proud. Instead, he laughed. Not kindly. Ridiculous. Soldiers take orders. Halsteads are saluted. Then he slammed his knife against his plate, and the conversation was over. My cheeks burned as my brothers smirked, relieved it wasn't their turn in his sights. My mother reached under the table and squeezed my hand, her silent way of saying, "Don't give up." That night, lying awake, I made myself a promise. I would remember his words, not as chains to hold me down, but as fuel to prove him wrong. The truth was simple. Power without empathy is hollow. My father commanded fear. I wanted to earn respect. He measured legacy in glass towers. I wanted mine to be built on honor. That divide, invisible then, would only grow wider with time. From the moment I could walk, my father had mapped out my path. Prep school, Ivy League, a polished seat on the board, and eventually the corner office of Halstead Enterprises. He didn't see me as a child. He saw me as a future executive, a piece in the machine he was building. But I never fit his blueprint. While my brothers studied balance sheets and perfected golf swings, I was sneaking military history books under the covers at night. At the dinner table, when Dad lectured about mergers, I stared at the flag outside the window and wondered what it would feel like to earn the right to salute it. The first time he caught me ironing his old, forgotten ROTC uniform, he laughed, not kindly. "Don't waste your time. Soldiers take orders. CEOs give them." That was his worldview in one sentence. Uniforms beneath suits, service beneath status. By high school, the gap between us was a canyon. My brothers walked in lockstep with him. Replicas in pressed blazers and confident smirks. I gravitated to the ROTC kids drilling on the football field, their boots pounding in unison. That rhythm made sense to me in a way stock tickers never could. When I told him I wanted to apply to the Naval Academy, he reacted as if I'd announced I was joining a circus. His voice was sharp, final. "You're throwing away every advantage I've given you. Do you know what people will say when they see my daughter crawling through mud instead of running board meetings? They'll laugh at you, at me." My reply was shaky but steady. "I don't care what they say. This is my choice." He stared at me with the kind of look that could freeze stone, then delivered the sentence that would echo for years. "If you walk down that path, don't expect me to walk beside you." And he meant it. But if anything, his rejection solidified my resolve. I pored over academy applications, memorized regulations, and ran before sunrise until my lungs burned. My mother, quietly defiant, slipped me study guides and brochures when he wasn't looking. She knew I needed a life outside the marble halls of his empire. The day the acceptance letter arrived from Annapolis, my hands shook. It wasn't fear, it was freedom. The day I held my acceptance letter from Annapolis, I thought maybe, just maybe, my father would soften. I was wrong. He stared at the envelope for 30 seconds, muttered, "So you're serious about this nonsense?" Then walked out of the room. He didn't speak to me again for 2 months. That silence stung more than shouting ever could. It was punishment without a word, a reminder that I had stepped outside his script. But if anything, it confirmed I was making the right choice. Annapolis was brutal. Up before dawn, running until my lungs felt like fire. Push-ups until my arms trembled. Inspections where a wrinkle in your uniform meant hours of drills. I remember standing in formation, sweat dripping down my back, an instructor shouting in my face, "Think Daddy's money can save you here. Think again." I wanted to yell back that I'd walked away from that money, but I didn't. I just kept moving. Every insult, every punishing task became fuel. Failure wasn't an option, not because of pride alone, but because I couldn't let my father be right. There were nights I collapsed on my bunk, muscles screaming, wondering if maybe he was right, that I wasn't cut out for this. But then I'd picture him, drink in hand, smirking over some business magazine, waiting for word that I had quit. And that image lit a fire in me, stronger than any caffeine. By sophomore year, I found my rhythm. I studied harder than I ever had, stayed in the library when others went out, pushed myself on the track until my legs felt like steel. Slowly, I rose, not because I was the strongest, but because I refused to quit. I'll never forget my first promotion ceremony. Standing there while my commanding officer pinned on that bar, I felt the weight of responsibility press into my shoulder. Pride surged through me, the kind I'd been starved of at home. I called afterward, hoping maybe, just maybe, Dad would answer. The phone rang until it cut off. Weeks later, I got an envelope. Inside wasn't congratulations. It was a clipped article about my brother's Goldman Sachs internship, with a sticky note in his handwriting. "This is what success looks like." I tore it in half, and in that moment, the divide between us became permanent. Every holiday homecoming turned into another battlefield. My father would sit at the head of the table, bourbon in hand, and aim his words at me like darts. "So still playing soldier?" he'd ask, the sarcasm dripping. I'd answer evenly, "It's not playing." His reply was always sharp. "Medals don't pay mortgages." Mom tried to buffer the blows. "Not everything has to be about money, Richard," she'd say gently, but he would scoff, retreat into silence, and the tension would thicken like smoke. By dessert, I'd usually slip away, appetite gone, heart pounding, with a mix of anger and exhaustion. It wasn't that I craved his approval anymore. I had simply stopped expecting it. What hurt most wasn't his words. It was his refusal to see me at all. My achievements weren't invisible. They were deliberately ignored. Every time I sent home a photo of a ceremony, he countered with clippings about my brother's business wins. His silence became a wall, one I finally stopped trying to climb. But outside that house, I was finding victories of my own. At Annapolis, I learned how respect was earned, not inherited. I wasn't the strongest in my class, and I wasn't the loudest. But I endured. I showed up again and again, even when it hurt. That consistency mattered more than any flash of brilliance. My classmates became family. We sweated through drills together, carried each other when one fell, laughed in rare quiet moments when exhaustion made everything absurd. That bond meant more to me than any stock option ever could. I began to understand that leadership wasn't about commanding with volume. It was about trust. Could your team count on you, even when things fell apart? That was the question that mattered. By graduation, I wore my dress whites with pride, cap tucked under my arm, ribbons aligned with precision. Families filled the stands, waving flags, snapping photos, voices thick with pride. I scanned the crowd once, knowing the face I wanted to see would not be there. My father had chosen absence, but my mother was there, tears streaming down her cheeks. She hugged me so tightly afterward I could barely breathe. "He's wrong about you," she whispered. "You've already proven more than he ever has." Her words filled the space his silence left behind. By the time I deployed, I had stopped hoping my father would ever see me. The silence between us had turned permanent, like a wall too thick to break through. But I wasn't without family. I found one in places he never cared to look, in barracks, on decks, in the dust of far-off deserts. My comrades became my brothers and sisters. We didn't share blood, but we shared everything that mattered. We endured the same drills, carried the same packs, and bore the same scars. Trust wasn't optional. It was survival. There were no boardroom hierarchies, no family legacies. The only question was simple. Can I count on you? I earned their trust the way you earn muscle. Slowly, painfully, by showing up again and again, not with speeches but with presence. When someone stumbled, I picked them up. When fear crept in, I kept my voice steady, even when my own hands shook. Over time, that constancy mattered. Respect grew, not because of rank pinned on my chest, but because I could be relied on when things broke down. The first time I led a unit in the field, nerves nearly swallowed me whole. Orders don't sound the same when lives depend on them. But the men didn't look at me with doubt. They looked at me with expectation, the kind that says, "We'll follow if you'll lead." And so I led. My father would never understand, but those moments carried more weight than any title he could give. Each ribbon I earned told the story of that chosen family. One for nights spent awake under hostile skies. One for dragging a wounded comrade through fire. One for decisions that saved lives at the cost of scars. My father dismissed them as silly medals. But to my comrades, they weren't decoration. They were evidence. That difference became my compass. My father had his empire of glass towers, measured in stock prices and shareholder applause. I had an empire of loyalty and grit, measured in scars, trust, and the kind of respect that can't be bought. Blood had given me a family name, but fire, sweat, and sacrifice had given me a family I could choose. And in that choice, I found something he never had: belonging. The call came not to me, but to my commanding officer's office. That's how I learned my mother was dying. Through a bureaucratic message, already hours old. Late stage, the note said, "Hospice. A window. If I could get leave." The kind of window that closes before the ink dries on the request form. I flew home anyway. The city felt like an old suit that no longer fit, stiff and suffocating. The house smelled the same, lemon polish and money, but it felt emptier than ever. My mother lay in the bed, smaller than I remembered, hair gone, skin paper thin. I took her hand, cool in mine, and sat silently, as if words might break the moment. My father stood in the corner like a piece of dark furniture, tie still perfect, face unreadable. He didn't reach for me. He didn't speak. We watched the machines together, their beeps marking time like a cruel metronome. When she woke, her voice was barely a thread. "You look so strong," she whispered. "Are you strong?" I told her I was, because I had to be. She smiled faintly, soft at the edges, like the way people smile in old paintings. "Keep choosing what's true, even when it's not applauded." Those were her last clear words to me. Hours later, she was gone, quietly, gently, as if she refused to leave a mess behind. Afterward, I signed papers with the same efficiency I used on deployment. Death certificates, hospice forms, signatures lined up in neat boxes. My father never broke his composure. No tears, no cracks, no attempt to bridge the chasm between us. He left me to grieve in silence, the way he always had. I flew back to base with her words, folded into my pocket, like an order I intended to follow. Keep choosing what's true. It became the compass I leaned when doubt crept in, when fear tried to speak louder than resolve. My father and I didn't speak again. After the funeral, not a call, not a note. The silence between us hardened into something permanent. But her voice, gentle, unwavering, stayed with me, louder than his disdain had ever been. James wasn't the kind of man who filled a room with noise. He didn't need to. Where my father commanded attention, with volume and presence, James carried silence like armor. He could stand still and somehow make the air calmer, steadier. That's how I first noticed him. We met at the Pentagon during a joint working group. I was presenting on logistics reform, a dry subject that could have put anyone to sleep. But James sat in the back, arms folded, eyes sharp, listening without blinking. When the session ended, he caught me in the hallway. "You don't just move supplies," he said. "You move lives." It wasn't flattery. It was recognition. And that difference mattered. After that, our paths kept crossing. Briefings, field exercises, the endless carousel of military coordination. Each time he remembered something small. How I took my coffee, how I tucked my hair under my cover, how I stayed late to finish what others would have left undone. He never asked me to be softer or quieter. He never hinted I should be less. He simply saw me as I was. Our first date wasn't cinematic, just a diner off base, 2 plates of eggs, a waitress who called everyone honey. But I remember thinking, this is what normal feels like. No performance, no spotlight, just 2 people who had seen enough darkness to appreciate the light of ordinary things. James's steadiness became my ballast. When I came home late, smelling of diesel and gun oil, he didn't complain. He looked up from his book and smiled like I'd only been gone 5 minutes. When I doubted myself, he asked questions not out of curiosity, but respect. How do you keep men calm under fire? What does it feel like when a unit salutes you? I shrugged, saying, "It just feels like duty." He shook his head. "No, it feels like trust. Don't minimize it." The proposal matched the man. No fireworks, no spectacle, just a pier at sunset, boots scraping against wood, gulls circling above. He held out a small box and said, "I can't promise calm seas, but I'll row with you." I didn't cry. I didn't need to. I just said yes, because I already knew. From the moment we announced our engagement, the fault lines deepened. My father didn't call, didn't congratulate. Weeks later, at a family gathering, he finally cornered me near the bar. His glass of bourbon glistened in the low light, as he said flatly, "You'll wear a proper dress, not that costume. Not in front of my friends. You won't embarrass me." I met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not marrying you. I'm marrying him, and I'll wear what tells the truth." His jaw tightened. "Do you understand how humiliating this is? People will whisper. They'll laugh at you, at me. Then let them laugh," I replied. "At least I won't be lying." That was when I knew the battle lines were set. Planning the wedding was simple by design. James didn't want a spectacle, and neither did I. We chose the Naval Chapel. Clean lines, stained glass that caught the morning sun, pews worn by decades of prayers. The guest list was modest. Close friends, comrades, a few relatives I still spoke to. But word travels fast in the military. One by one, the SEALs told me, "We'll be there." Torres grinned, tapping his prosthetic against the floor. "You walked us through hell. We're not letting you walk to that altar alone." I tried to argue. They shook their heads. Non-negotiable. A week before the ceremony, I wrote my father a card, not out of hope. Hope had been stripped from me long ago, but out of completeness. "I'm getting married. 11300 hours. Naval Chapel. I'll be in uniform." I sealed it before I could add anything sharp I might regret. The night before the wedding, Turgeon kept James and me apart. He stayed with a close friend. I stayed in base quarters. At midnight I ironed my uniform, smoothing each crease with the same care I'd give to a battle plan. Shoes polished to mirrors, ribbons aligned like chapters of a book no one could erase. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a message from a number I hadn't saved but knew by heart. "You'll regret this tomorrow." I stared at the screen, not shocked, not wounded, just clear. This was who he was. And this was who I was not. I placed the phone face down, pressed the last crease into the white fabric, and whispered to the empty room, "Tomorrow, I walk as myself." The morning of the wedding dawned sharp and clear, the kind of navy blue sky you only see in spring. My stomach was steady. I'd faced mortars and machine guns. What was one more confrontation with the man who had never believed in me? Outside the chapel, My team gathered in quiet formation. Torres leaned on his prosthetic, calm as ever. Hill adjusted his cuffs and smirked. "You look like a commander about to take the field," he said. I smiled faintly. "Feels about the same. Difference is, this time you're walking with me." The chapel smelled of cedar polish when I stepped inside, my heels clicking against the stone floor in a rhythm that steadied me more than any prayer. Sunlight fractured through stained glass, painting shards of red and gold across rows of faces. 280 guests filled the pews. On one side, my father's world of suits and investors. On the other, my world uniforms. Ribbons, scars carried quietly. The organ began the processional, notes rising like a tide. My chest tightened, not with nerves but with clarity. Each step down the aisle wasn't just a walk, it was a march into truth. Halfway to the altar I saw James. Simple navy suit, eyes steady, pride unmistakable. But before I could reach him, the storm broke. My father rose from the front row, slow and deliberate, ensuring every eye was on him. He stepped into the aisle, blocking my path. The organ faltered, notes cutting off mid-chord. A murmur rippled across the crowd. He looked me up and down, lips curling into a sneer. His voice carried easily through the silence. "Take off those silly medals." The words dropped like stones into water. Gasps echoed. My throat tightened, but not with shame, with resolve. I met his eyes, spine straight. "No." For a beat, the world held its breath. Then his hand shot out, fast, a crack splitting the air as it struck my cheek. Pain burned. But I didn't stagger. Gasps erupted. A glass shattered in the back. And then James moved. His hand closed around my father's wrist with calm, iron grip. He leaned in, voice low but sharp enough to cut. "You just struck a decorated U.S. Navy officer." 8 words, enough to change everything. The silence after James spoke those 8 words was heavier than any gunfire I'd ever stood under. 280 people held their breath, watching the balance of power tilt. My father, the man who had spent a lifetime commanding rooms, suddenly looked small, pale, trembling, his wrist trapped in James' steady grip. Then Torres's voice rang out from the side aisle. Strong, sure, impossible to ignore. "Admiral on deck." The room responded instantly. Every uniformed guest snapped to attention, saluting in crisp unison. Even the civilians, unsure but earnest, stood taller, some raising hands in awkward imitation. The chapel was no longer my father's stage. It had become a hall of respect. For years he had dismissed my ribbons as meaningless, my service as wasted time. But in that moment, they were the only truth in the room. They outweighed every dollar he'd earned, every skyscraper with his name on it. The empire he had built couldn't summon a single salute. Mine, born of sweat and scars, commanded the whole room. James released his wrist with deliberate care, as if letting go of something already broken. My father stumbled half a step back, rubbing at the cuff of his tuxedo like he could smooth away humiliation. His mouth opened as if to launch into one of his boardroom tirades, but no words came. For once, silence defeated him. I felt the burn on my cheek, but it no longer mattered. The sting had transformed into clarity. This wasn't just about a slap. It wasn't about a uniform, or even a wedding. It was about authority shifting, about a room of witnesses declaring where honor truly belonged. I looked at him, really looked. The man who had spent my entire life telling me I wasn't enough now stood diminished under the weight of respect he could never. He had always believed medals were silly, but in that chapel they carried more weight than his fortune ever could. The aisle stretched ahead of me like a battlefield won. With each step I left behind his empire of glass and walked toward a life built on truth, on loyalty, on the kind of respect that doesn't shatter under judgment. For as long as I could remember, my father thrived on control. He filled rooms with his voice, bent conversations to his advantage, and treated silence as weakness. But in that chapel, with 280 people standing in judgment, he had none of it left. His face drained of color, his jaw tight but trembling. The hand James had held still hovered awkwardly, as if unsure what to do without dominance. For once, the man who prided himself on precision looked unsteady. His empire of polished suits and glass towers couldn't shield him from this moment. James released him with deliberate calm, stepping back like a soldier, letting go of something already defeated. My father stumbled, gripping his cane harder than usual. His tuxedo cuff wrinkled from the encounter. He looked smaller, shrunk not by age, but by exposure. The room said everything he could not. People didn't murmur or gossip. They simply stood, eyes steady. Verdict delivered. The authority he had built through intimidation had dissolved under the weight of respect freely given to others. For me, the sting of his slap lingered, but it no longer hurt. It had become fuel. My pride stood taller than it ever had. I wasn't just his daughter, not just a bride walking an aisle. I was a decorated officer. A woman who had carried her weight in deserts, on decks, and in moments where silence was survival. And now the room saw it too. My father tried once more to gather himself, his mouth twitching as if to speak. But no speech came, no tirade, no command. The boardroom king had nothing to offer. A chapel filled with people who measured worth not by profit, but by sacrifice. He lowered his eyes, the first concession I had ever seen him make. A man who had never yielded an inch was suddenly cornered by He sat down slowly, shoulders hunched, like someone who realized the battle was lost before it began. Later, he would leave quietly, no grand exit, no parting words, just a man slipping into the night, diminished, stripped of the power he once thought unshakable. And I didn't chase him, I didn't need to. The verdict had already been spoken, and it was final. And I looked down at the ribbons on my chest. I didn't see decorations. I saw evidence. Each one was a story. Long nights without sleep. Missions carried out under fire. Decisions made when failure wasn't an option. They weren't shiny tokens to impress a crowd. They were survival, etched in fabric and metal. My father had always called them silly. Beneath me, a waste of the advantages he had worked so hard to secure. But in that chapel, those silly medals were the only truth that mattered. They carried more weight than every contract he had signed, every skyscraper stamped with his name. Revenge didn't come in raising my hand back to him. It came in standing tall, refusing to fold, refusing to strip away the story I had built with my own blood and grit. People think revenge is about destruction, about cutting someone down, but the sharpest revenge is to stand so firm, so unapologetically yourself, that the person who tried to diminish you can no longer look down. My father's legacy will always be well. He will be remembered as a CEO, a man who built an empire of glass and steel. But glass breaks, steel rusts, money is spent and forgotten. My legacy is different. Mine is honor, earned in deserts and seas, carried in scars and ribbons, saluted by people who never once asked me to be less. It is the kind of respect that cannot be bought, cannot be faked, and cannot be erased by anyone else's judgment. As James and I stood together at the altar, I realized the aisle hadn't just been a path to marriage. It had been a battlefield. His world and mine had collided there. And for once, my father didn't win. He couldn't, because wealth can command attention, but only honor commands respect. The sting on my cheek had already faded into something else. Vindication. I didn't need his applause, his approval, or his acceptance. My medals, my vows, my life, they weren't his to command. They were mine to carry. That was the real legacy. And no slap, no sneer, no empire could ever take it away. When the reception ended and the crowd began to drift away, whispers still rippled, like wind through tall grass. People replayed the moment again and again. The slap, the silence, the 8 words that changed everything. But what stayed wasn't the scandal. It was the clarity. Later that night, James and I stepped outside, the moonlight pulling silver across the water. He brushed his thumb gently against my cheek, where the mark still lingered. "Does it hurt?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not anymore." He smiled. "Good. Because what people will remember isn't the slap, it's how you stood." And he was right. That's the thing about respect. People think it comes from titles, from bloodlines, from money stacked high enough to block out the sun. But respect doesn't bend to wealth. It doesn't follow orders from fear. Real respect is earned in deserts, in seas, in moments when you choose truth, even when it costs you. My father will always be a rich CEO. That's his story, his legacy. But mine is different. Mine is honor, built from scars that no one can buy, and loyalty that no one can counterfeit. When 280 people rose to their feet that day, they weren't standing for money or image, they were standing for respect. And if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told you weren't enough, then you already know this truth. Your worth isn't decided by those who try to diminish you. It comes from what you endure, what you build, and the truth you refuse to strip away, no matter who demands it. So remember who stood for you when others didn't. Remember who saluted you, not because they had to, but because they chose to. That is where honor lives. This isn't just my story, it's a reminder. If you've carried scars, if you've been told your medals, whatever they are, don't matter, then know this: they matter more than any empire of glass and steel. Stand tall, stay true, because one day when the room rises, it won't be for wealth. It will be for respect.